Chapter 1. The Fire That Ate Money. Imagine waking up one cold morning to find that the money you'd saved your whole life, enough yesterday to buy a comfortable home, could now barely buy a loaf of bread. That's what happened to Eric Bauer, a clerk living in the crumbling heart of post-World War I Germany. He counted his salary each month only to discover that by the time he reached the market, the price of food had doubled. The shopkeepers stopped giving change. Factories paid their workers twice a day, hoping they could buy something before the currency collapsed again. People carried cash in wheelbarrows, not wallets. Children built forts out of bundles of marks. Old women burned money for warmth. It was cheaper than wood. Germany's defeat in the Great War had left the nation bleeding. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an impossible sum, 132 billion gold marks, as reparations. The government of the Weimar Republic, desperate and cornered, turned to the printing press. At first, it seemed to work. The debts were paid, wages increased, and the streets filled with optimism. But soon, that optimism curdled into panic. Prices began to double, then triple, then explode. By November 1923, the German mark was so worthless that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Eric's wife, Marta, wept one evening as she tried to buy milk for their daughter. "It was 10,000 marks this morning," she said, clutching the coins. "Now it's 2 million. Eric looked at her hands, trembling around the worthless paper. "Money isn't real anymore," he whispered. "It's smoke." They weren't the only ones losing faith. Across Berlin, entire families watched their savings vanish in days. The middle class, once proud, once stable, was destroyed. People stopped trusting banks, contracts, even each other. Because once a society loses faith in its currency, everything else begins to break. Commerce dies. Salaries mean nothing. Promises collapse. And when trust collapses, desperation moves in. Eric began to hear whispers in the beer halls. Men with angry eyes and promises of strength, vengeance, and rebirth. "Germany will rise again," they said. "But only when we destroy the traitors who ruined us." He didn't know their names then. But the seed had been planted. And from that soil of despair and chaos, a darker future was already taking root. Within a decade, a man named Adler Kruger, a fierce orator with burning eyes, would seize power, feeding on the rage born from that economic ruin. The fire of hyperinflation had not only consumed money, it had ignited the soul of a nation. Chapter 2. The Land of Vanishing Zeros. Half a world away and nearly 80 years later, the sun rose over Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, bathing its broken streets in a dusty orange light. Tendai Moyo, once a proud schoolteacher, stood in line at a bakery clutching a stack of notes so thick it looked like a small pillow. Yesterday, that money could have bought enough food for a week. Today, it might not even buy a single loaf of bread. The year was 2008. President Rufus Mugabe's government had turned the country's rich farmland into chaos. What had once been the breadbasket of Africa was now barren. Farms lay abandoned, factories silent. The government solution, like so many before it, was to print money. Bills flooded the streets. New notes came every few weeks. 10 million, 100 billion, 100 trillion. Cash lost value faster than people could count. Prices doubled every day. Shoppers ran to markets the moment they were paid, desperate to trade paper for anything real: flour, cooking oil, fuel. At the bakery counter, Tendai watched a woman argue with the cashier. "This note is from last week," the woman cried, holding up a faded bill. The cashier shook his head. "It's no good anymore. You need the new one." "What's new about it?" "Just more zeros." Everyone laughed bitterly. It was the only kind of laughter left. By evening, Tendai's salary, once the pride of a teacher, couldn't buy a bus ticket home. His wife, Nairai, had stopped asking when things would get better. She had already begun to trade jewelry for rice. The newspapers no longer printed numbers. They couldn't. The zeros filled entire pages. So the government simply gave up. They stopped pretending the Zimbabwean dollar was real and allowed people to use US dollars, South African rands, anything that still meant something. But for most, it was already too late. Pensions vanished. Savings evaporated. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Families were torn apart as millions fled across borders in search of a stable life. Tendai walked home through the quiet streets that evening, passing children selling candles and fuel on the sidewalks. He carried a single loaf of bread, his day's victory. He looked up at the empty billboard above the street and imagined it saying what everyone already knew but no one dared to write. Money isn't wealth anymore. Survival is. Real wealth now lived in things you could hold: land, food, skill, community. Paper meant nothing. And just like in Germany so many decades before, it wasn't just the currency that collapsed. It was belief. Chapter 3. The Currency of Dust. Summer, 1946. Budapest, Hungary. The air was heavy with smoke, dust, and the faint metallic scent of decay. The war was over, but the peace felt hollow. Buildings were cracked open like old bones, the streets littered with rubble and the faces of the hungry. Among them walked Istvan Kovacs, a tailor who once sewed fine suits for officers and businessmen. Now, he mended torn rags in exchange for bread or a handful of potatoes. The shop window that once displayed his best work was now covered in brown newspaper to hide the emptiness inside. The new currency, the penge, arrived with promises of recovery, but those promises didn't last long. The government, drowning in war debt and reconstruction costs, printed more and more notes. At first, Istvan laughed at the absurdity. Then, he stopped laughing. Prices began to double every few hours. What cost 1 penge in the morning might cost 2 by night. By summer, it was every 15 hours. The newspapers called it temporary instability. The people called it madness. Istvan's friend, Miklos, came to him one afternoon, holding a stack of money so large it nearly spilled from his arms. "I sold my bicycle," he said. "This is what they gave me." Istvan looked at the pile. It wasn't wealth, it was paper. "You should have kept the bicycle," he replied. Soon, new notes began to appear. The milpengo, worth 1,000,000 penge. Then the b-penge, 1,000,000,000 penge. The numbers grew so fast that even the printing presses couldn't keep up. They had to stamp old notes with new zeros. People carried sacks of cash to the market only to come home empty-handed. Banks stopped opening. Wages were meaningless. The middle class, once the pride of Hungary, disappeared overnight. Miklos sold his furniture. Istvan sold his tools. Marta, his wife, traded her wedding ring for a few kilograms of flour. One morning, the government made a final announcement. The penge was dead. A new currency, the forint, would replace it. Everything old was worthless. Entire savings vanished in a single decree. Istvan stood in his silent tailor shop that day, surrounded by useless paper, and whispered to himself, "All gone, even the past." Because hyperinflation hadn't just destroyed his present, it had erased his history. The receipts, the wages, the promises, all reduced to dust. When trust in money dies, memory dies with it. Chapter 4. The Nation That Ate Its Future. The oil fields shimmered under the Caribbean sun, stretching endlessly beyond the cracked highways of Venezuela. Once, this land was a symbol of wealth, a nation built on black gold. But by the 2010s, that gold had turned into poison. In a narrow apartment in Caracas, Diego Ramirez, a civil engineer, stared at a flickering light bulb. Power cuts were common now. His wife, Isabella, boiled rice in a dented pot, careful not to waste a single grain. The pantry shelves, once stocked with imported goods, were nearly bare. Just a few years earlier, Diego had earned enough to live comfortably, but now his monthly salary couldn't buy a carton of eggs. Every day, prices climbed higher, 1,000,000% inflation in a single year. It sounded like fiction, but it was real. "Tomorrow it'll cost double," Isabella said quietly, watching the rice bubble. Diego forced a smile. "Then we eat tonight." Outside, the markets were chaos. Shelves empty, lines stretching around corners. People traded soap for flour, medicine for gasoline. Money had become meaningless again, numbers on paper, zeros without value. The government, led by President Esteban Murillo, blamed economic war and foreign conspiracies. Yet behind the speeches, the truth was obvious. Years of corruption, reckless spending, and blind printing had eaten the country alive. The bolivar, once proud, once strong, was mutilated by zeros. When the bills became too absurd, the government simply cut 6 zeros off overnight. The same lie, repackaged. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Teachers left classrooms. Engineers like Diego became taxi drivers or fled the country to wash dishes in foreign cities. Millions walked across borders, their suitcases stuffed not with money, but with memories. One evening, Diego walked home past a mural of the national flag, its colors faded and peeling. Below it, someone had spray-painted, "We were rich once." He stopped and stared. In the silence of that street, he understood what hyperinflation really meant. Not just numbers gone wrong, but hope turned to dust. Wealth wasn't the only thing lost. Dignity, identity, and trust had vanished too. And once again, like Germany and Hungary before, the pattern had repeated, the same mistake wearing a new flag. The government could print money, but it couldn't print faith. Chapter 5. The Age of Paper Empires. The world had changed, or so it liked to believe. Glass towers replaced the ruins, and digital screens replaced banknotes. But underneath the sleek glow of modern finance, the same heartbeat pulsed, the quiet rhythm of debt, belief, and denial. In New York, Ethan Cole, an analyst at a large investment firm, stared at charts glowing red across his monitors. The numbers weren't just falling, they were unraveling. Interest rates rising. Markets trembling. "Relax," his supervisor said. "It's just a correction." But Ethan wasn't so sure. He'd read too much history to mistake smoke for fog. Across the ocean, Amira Khan, a young mother in London, scrolled through grocery prices on her phone. "Why is bread double what it was last year?" she whispered. Her paycheck hadn't changed. The bills had. She tightened her coat and thought of her grandmother's stories. Stories of ration lines and desperate hands. History, it seemed, had a long memory. And in Washington, cameras flashed as officials reassured the world, inflation is temporary. The system is strong. Yet the printing presses, now digital, never stopped. Trillions flowed into markets, debt stacked like cards in a house too tall to stand. It all felt familiar. Ethan began collecting headlines. Germany, 1923. Hungary, 1946. Zimbabwe, 2008. Venezuela, 2018. Yugoslavia, 1993. Each one told the same story in a different accent. "We're smarter now," the world said. But the old pattern had only evolved, dressed in algorithms, hidden in screens. Inflation no longer came with wheelbarrows of cash. It came with invisible zeros, creeping quietly through digital accounts. It whispered in higher rent, thinner paychecks, and shrinking groceries. The same theft, just cleaner. One night, Ethan stood on his apartment balcony overlooking the city lights and thought of a single, terrifying truth. Money is only real because we agree it is. If belief breaks, even for a moment, the entire system could collapse faster than any printing press could save it. And so, like the countless souls before them, people began to prepare quietly. They learned new skills. They bought what held real value. They built networks of trust that no government could inflate away. Because history had spoken clearly, real wealth is not paper. It's power, resilience, and understanding. The world wasn't in hyperinflation. Not yet. But the warning signs were there: arrogance, denial, dependence, and debt. Somewhere, deep within the global machine, the same whisper echoed that had haunted every generation before. This could never happen here. And as those words drifted into the night, Ethan closed his laptop and murmured to himself, "That's what they all said, right before it did."